Well, in this video, we want to answer the question, how did we get the Old Testament? What's the process by which the Old Testament text was formed over many years so that now we can read it in English in the year 2018? Well, the answer to this question is actually fairly complicated, but I want to just summarize it so that we can understand where the Old Testament text came from and how it was formed. Now, along the way, another question that we sort of want to address is the Old Testament text reliable? Can we trust it? Is it accurate? A lot of people today who criticize Christianity and the Bible would say, well, no, we can't trust it. The Old Testament is old and it's an ancient text, and by the time we read it today, thousands of years later, there must be lots of mistakes in it. Well, that's not true, and we want to talk about the authority and accuracy of the Old Testament. So how did we get the Old Testament? Well, we already said that the Old Testament was inspired by God, and we got it from God. Well, what we want to do now is sort of look at the other side of the equation, the human side, because we also said that God inspired human beings to write the text. So let's look at that more human process by which the Old Testament text was formed. Well, obviously, there was an original author who wrote the text somewhere between the years 1400 and 400 BC. Now, that's a long time, a 1,000-year period. And it was during that 1,000 years that the 39 books of the Old Testament were written. We can talk about the orality of Scripture and then a literary development. Since the culture of Israel in Old Testament times was mostly an oral culture, we might actually think of the Old Testament books as having originated in an oral way and being passed on that way before it was written down. And then the 39 books of the Old Testament also went through a very complex literary development. That is, the authors didn't just write them and then immediately they were in their final form, but rather for many years these Old Testament books were edited and redacted. Some additions were made, some corrections were made, and it took a very long time for the book to go from its sort of original author in its core form to its final form in which the community used it. We can say, though, that the 39 books of the Old Testament reached their final form in about the year 200 BC. We should also add that the 39 books of the Old Testament were originally written in Hebrew. That was the language of the Israelites in Old Testament times, and so the 39 books were all written in Hebrew. And then they were copied and copied and copied again until it was eventually translated into English so that we can read the Old Testament in English. You might know that the first English translation of the Bible was the King James Version in about the year 1611. But there are many other English translations. There's the Revised Standard Version, there's the English Standard Version, there's the New International Version. I sort of am, like the New International Version, referred to as the NIV. And that's what I'll be using in this course. So we said that the 39 Old Testament books achieved their final form in about the year 200 BC. And here's a statement that we find in one of those apocryphal books, not in the Old Testament, but one of those books from between the Testaments, that refers to the three sections of the Old Testament that we know as the Tanakh: the law, the prophecies, and the rest of the books, or the Ketuvim. And there's a reference to the entire Old Testament being finally formed in the year 200 BC. Here's a statement from Jesus that we've seen before from the 1st century AD, where Jesus also refers to the three sections of the Old Testament: the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the Ketuvim. So we can see that the Old Testament books were being read and used by the community by at least 200 BC and certainly in the time of Jesus. So who wrote the Old Testament? Well, the answer is there are many authors. Many people had a hand in the production of the Old Testament. But we can say that Moses was probably one of the first people to be involved in the production of the Old Testament. Moses, writing in about 1400 BC, is traditionally credited with being the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then over a 1,000-year period of time, the rest of the books of the Old Testament were written. And a person named Ezra was probably one of the last people to be involved in the production of the Old Testament. Ezra himself has a book in the Old Testament called Ezra, but Ezra also probably is the one who brought the 5 books of the Pentateuch together into one volume. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, written independently, but then Ezra in about 400 BC brought those books together. Then, as we said, the authors sort of wrote the books, but then these books went through a complex literary development over the years before they reached their final form. So traditionally, Moses wrote the Torah and the prophets wrote their books. But if you read the Torah, there are certainly non-Mosaic sections of the Torah. For example, the section that talks about Moses' death. Moses didn't write that. And we also know that the prophets had disciples and scribes who recorded and wrote things down that the prophets spoke. In the end, the literature of the Old Testament is anonymous. None of the authors put their names on the book, but rather these are anonymous books. Now, there are good reasons to believe that Moses wrote the Torah and the prophets wrote their books, but in the end, the books are anonymous. So how did we get the Old Testament? Well, an original author wrote somewhere in that 1,000-year period. Maybe it was oral at first and then went through a literary development of editing and redacting, and then the books reached their final form in Hebrew, used by the community in about 200 BC. And then that final form of the text was copied and copied and copied by various scribes. A family of scribes who especially took great care to copy the text of the Old Testament Hebrew were called the Masoretes. And they worked from about 500 to 1000 AD, and the text that they produced in 1000 AD, the Hebrew text, is referred to as the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text that dates to about 1000 AD is the oldest text in Hebrew that we have of the Old Testament that's complete. That's as far back as we can go to put our hands on a piece of paper with the Old Testament written in Hebrew. So, we have an original manuscript that was copied and copied and copied and copied and used by the community. The most reliable, complete, oldest copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew, again, is that Masoretic text produced by the Masoretes. Now, this family of scribes called the Masoretes, who copied the Old Testament text, did 3 things that helped accurately preserve the text as they received it. One of the things they did was to create a system of vowels. Originally, the Hebrew text was written without vowels. Now, obviously, you need vowels to pronounce the text and vocalize it, but it was written without vowels on the page. So sometimes words, depending on the vowels, might be confused for another word. And so what the Masoretes did is that they added vowels so that there would be no mistake as to how to pronounce the word. Another thing that the Masoretes did was they created a system of accent marks. And originally, the Hebrew text was written just as a solid line of consonants without any word divisions. And so what the accent marks did was to help create word divisions, or to know which consonants went with which words. And so the Masoretes added those as well. And then the final thing that the Masoretes did was that they added detailed notes on the text. For example, they would write at the end of each book, and then at the end of the Torah, the first 5 books, exactly how many letters were in that book or in the Torah, how many verses. They identified the middle word of the Torah, the middle letter of the Torah, and whoever was copying a book or the entire Torah would have to count those letters and words and verses, and if it didn't have the exact number, then it would have to be scrapped and they would have to start over. For example, the Masoretes noted that there were 5,845 verses in the Torah, and there had to be exactly that many verses by whoever copied it. They also noted that there were 400,945 letters in the Torah. They identified the middle word and the middle letter. This was obviously meticulous copying, and they wanted to make sure that the text was accurate and reliable as they copied it. Here you can see sort of a picture of the Hebrew text. That's Hebrew. Obviously, you can't read it, but there are vowel marks, there are accent marks, and here in this red box are the notes at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, or the last book in the Torah, as to exactly how many letters and verses there are in the Torah. So the Masoretes took great care to copy the text and preserve the text exactly as they had received it. So what are some of the witnesses that we have to the Old Testament text? Obviously, we don't have what the original authors wrote. We have copies of copies of copies. But there are other texts that were written in Hebrew or sometimes in translations that bear witness to the original text. Well, we already said that the Masoretic text is the most reliable and best witness, the complete witness to the Hebrew Old Testament text. But another witness is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, it's a good witness because it's written in Hebrew. It's old. It dates to 1000 A.D. But the bad thing about the Samaritan Pentateuch is that it only has the Torah in it. It only is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So it's not complete. Another witness is the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a good witness because it's old, but the bad thing about the Septuagint is that it's not written in Hebrew. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament text. So it's a translation. And as you know, in translations, sometimes you can't actually do a word-for-word translation. There are some differences there. Another witness is the Aramaic Targums. These are fairly old. They are written in Aramaic, so not exactly Hebrew, but the Targums are actually loose paraphrases, so they don't actually accurately translate the Hebrew Old Testament text. Another witness to the Old Testament text is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you can see that the Dead Sea Scrolls are old. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written in Hebrew. The bad thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, is that they're not complete. Now, we said that the Masoretic text is the best witness. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which we're going to talk about in the next video, were discovered in 1947. And the Dead Sea Scrolls actually can be placed in second position, and they become the second best reliable witness to the Old Testament Hebrew text. And we're going to talk about why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important in the next video.